Good morning, folks. We're just waiting for people to file in from the waiting room, and we'll get started with today's conversation in just a couple of minutes. Once again, good morning. We'll get started here in just a couple of moments as we wait for people to file in from the waiting room. Thank you for your patience. And again, thanks for your patience. I think we'll just go ahead and get started. I know others will file in as we do our little opening remarks and introduction. But in the interest of sticking to time, I'd like to welcome you all here today for this, which is our sixth conversation in a series of 10 sponsored by the Winter Foundation and the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine, exploring the future of public anthropology. I'm Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the University of California at Irvine. UC Irvine and its servers, I suppose I should say, are located within the ancestral and unceded shared territories of the Tongva and Achamin people. The region extends from the Santa Ana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. As members of a land-grant institution, we acknowledge the Achamin and Tongva as the traditional land caretakers whose efforts to steward and protect the land continue today. Taylor?
And I'm Taylor Nelms. I'm the Senior Director of Research at the Filene Research Institute. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you today, and we're really thrilled to be joined by Dr. Eli Thorkelson. Eli is a scholar of gender and politics, utopianism, and academic labor and institutions. Eli received their PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago and currently works as a software developer in Decatur, Georgia. Eli's written some of the most trenchant reflections and critiques, I think, of the work and workers of anthropology, and was the leading force behind the Anthropology Collective, a recent experiment in forming an alternative that is transnational, inclusive, anti-authoritarian, anti-racist, feminist, decolonial, and democratic anthropology organization, professional organization. Later on, we'll be joined by 3 PhD students, Kim Fernandez from the University of Pennsylvania, Nina Medvedeva from the University of Minnesota, and Nima Yolmo from the University of California, Irvine. We want to thank the Winter Grin Foundation and the UCI School of Social Sciences for their support for this series. And we want to ask all of the folks who've joined us on this call, please do feel free to ask questions. We'll all be monitoring those questions, especially Kim, Nina, and Nima. And we'll be excited to engage with those questions towards the end of the conversation. So welcome, Eli. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here virtually. It's my first virtual seminar, so that's an experience.
It is definitely an experience, and one that unfortunately I think we've gotten somewhat accustomed to. These are much more fun to do in person, but in any case, we'll make do. Maybe we could start, Eli, by asking you just to kind of lay the groundwork for us. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how you ended up doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, right. So as I think you must be expecting at this point, what I have to say is that answering this question has become a problem for me. And the reason that it's become a problem for me is that, so I got my doctorate in 2014, and I had finished, I was already doing software basically to pay the rent while I was finishing graduate school. And so a year after I did that, I had a postdoc for like a year and a half. And then I had a faculty job that was in a different continent from my family for like a year. And it kind of became apparent to me that the to a career academic couple thing was going to be like a family disaster. And where I was teaching, which is in Stellenbosch University in South Africa, was, although it's in some ways a very fascinating place to teach, was also very politically complicated because essentially I've been hired because of having academic capital from the North, and this is a university system that's in the middle of trying to decolonize. So I did not feel like my being in South Africa was necessarily kind of a political contribution as much as kind of the content of what I was teaching was supposed to be relevant. And so essentially I decided that it was better to be unemployed and think about what to do with my life than to keep having a faculty job that was kind of a precarious situation just in terms of having a partner and child and things that actually enter into people's lives and career calculations. And I think even by that point, I had found academia very kind of agonizing, just because there is so much uncertainty and so much precarity. And even when you manage to get a job after you've applied for dozens or hundreds of other jobs, the amount that you have torn your hair out is kind of a problem. I say this even though I have no hair, but anyway, I had more hair when I started graduate school, I can tell you that right now. And so the work that I was doing, I guess to answer your question, was a kind of reflexive anthropology of the university. My dissertation was about university life in France. And I became more interested in writing about precarity as a result of living it, as a result of being involved in graduate student labor organizing, and as a result of just finding out that it was kind of the thing that needed speaking about, and that, I think there is something to be learned from doing ethnography of precarious work. I at least have learned some important things from doing that. And so I kind of became more interested in doing that. So eventually, I guess I came back to the United States in 2018, I think. And I was, let me think, I looked after a baby for a year and I was an adjunct, and they're just, the faculty hiring situation is a disaster. I feel like discussing this is not what we're here to talk about, but it is true. Um, and so it became easier to kind of have a career plan B, which is what I'm doing right now. And my last ditch kind of thing that I did in anthropology, if you can put it this way, was to try to have a alternative scholarly society that was less elitist than the AAA. I'm just going to say that I consider the AAA very elitist and hierarchical and very market-oriented kind of organization that basically is doing like rent, is a rent-seeking organization that charges a toll to everybody to be involved in the quote-unquote field, and that attempts to define the field as being tantamount to its own meeting, which I think in a global perspective is a kind of imperial move as well. So I think that there's kind of a lot of reasons to look for alternative venues and alternative forms of infrastructure, and maybe we can talk about the fact that the alternative society that we tentatively worked on forming for a year has not really worked out. And I think there may be some lessons to be learned from that. But that is kind of how I have gotten to the present. Sorry, it's more of like a career narrative. But I think that as a materialist, I think that thinking about our careers is kind of one important thing to think about. And so there's a reason to recall it, even though there's obviously this kind of danger in biography. I was going to start out by saying I was going to resist biography, but I've given you a very capsule one at least.
We can give you an opportunity right now to resist biography and get even more materialist if you like, because your story wended through institutional spaces sustained by various infrastructures, and you've done a whole bunch of thinking about that. And so I wonder if you maybe want to switch gears and talk about those institutions and infrastructures and their dismantling, their loss, their et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think that, I don't know if people have come across a book called The University in Ruins, which is about 25 years old. So this book came to my mind as I was thinking about this conversation. And what I thought was, it's been like decades. It's been since the end of the Cold War, more or less, that adjunctification has continued to grow, and crises in academic labor and reproduction have continued to grow, and people have been trying to think about what this means kind of for the institutions that are there. The institutions are there, right? Higher education continues to be a very large industry, and it attracts millions of students in the United States and many millions more students worldwide, and has probably millions of academics working in it, although much smaller, at least hundreds of thousands. I didn't actually look up the number. So it's a lot of people, and it's as a kind of, if you want to call it a large ship, it's not about to just kind of turn on a dime or just cease to exist outright, although I think we are going to keep seeing smaller and more precarious institutions just going under. I think that that probably is going to keep being a thing. It's probably not going to be a thing that will affect like a big research university of the kind where people are getting doctorates, although there are program closures in those places as well sometimes. And I think that places like Wisconsin, where there's been like a lot of politics around which disciplines are going to be permitted to exist, that's also a sign of the times and is pointing us in some direction. But in any case, so the university in ruins being like 26 years old, I think, has been an argument that people have been making for a while. And in some ways, the university isn't in ruins. It just is having a series of reproduction crises and shrinkage, probably. And calling it ruins is melodramatic. And I think, nevertheless, kind of from the perspective of somebody who's not in academia, and I try not to identify as an academic because the infrastructures are not really there for me to do so in a way that kind of feels good, particularly. In that sense, I feel like a complete Martian having this seminar. But I think the question is like, how should one relate to the academic behemoth that is out there, and what are different strategies available for doing that? Labor organizing is the strategy that I think is actually making some kinds of progress in changing consciousness as well as actual salaries and things. I think there's a line of work like the Harney and Moten argument that the only possible relationship to the university is a criminal one, and which comes out of Black Studies and is well worth reading if people have not encountered it. And so there are different ways of imagining occupying the university if one is not kind of its hegemonic subject. I don't really have much to say to the hegemonic subject of the university because I understand pretty adequately what is involved in being a hegemonic subject of the university, and I don't think they understand what is involved in being me. And I don't think that there's a lot of room for dialogue. And I think this is one of those things about organizing people, is that you have to organize people with whom you have something in common. So the question that precarity raises for us is, with whom do we have something in common? And when are there communications barriers such that communication is probably not going to happen? I mean, I have a lot of friends and former classmates who are like tenure track professors, and it's been like a huge strain on our friendship because they no longer know what to talk to me about. And they're inclined to talk to me about the exact things that kind of academics are socialized to talk about, which is that like you're a self with the project and you kind of are emanating yourself out in the world and then implicitly building your reputation, or a meaner word for it might be brand, by producing a series of eminent publications and showing up at things and being visible. So I think that one of the things that you might have to question is, if you're not in that, and it has very narrow material conditions of possibility. If you're not in that, what kind of visibility do you want to inhabit, and with whom? I think that's kind of the question. And so that's why I'm interested in alternative kinds of infrastructures. Sorry if that doesn't entirely answer your question, though.
No, I think that's, I mean, in many ways, really exciting to hear from you, even though it's a really difficult thing for those of us both inside, outside, kind of alongside, academic spaces. The struggle, right? The struggle is real in trying to position ourselves literally in relationship to the people who occupy or find themselves within some of those spaces. So I wonder, Eli, if I might ask you to, you've already named folks that maybe you've taken inspiration from or are thinking with, but I wonder if you might also reflect, this is a kind of recurring theme throughout these conversations, about some of, we've been talking about fellow travelers that we've been taken kind of to task around that phrasing, and with good reason. But I do wonder, if there are folks who help you navigate that relation building and breaking as you kind of navigate your own professional career and obviously personal trajectory as well.
Yeah, well, I guess I think that I don't know. I'm not really sure how to answer this question, actually, which is kind of weird and unexpected. Since, if one is socialized to do anything in academia, it's to be able to answer questions and kind of have this like relentless will to speak. And I kind of feel like saying there's something there's something intimate about asking me that, which has to do with the fact that like to have comrades in a moment of vulnerability is a difficult and a precarious thing in itself to arrange. So it's hard for me to kind of say that. And if I could give you a list of names, I wouldn't name it right here, I don't think. But I think that the people with whom I feel something in common, I mean, there are people who it's kind of a generational thing. There are lots and lots of people who have been in academia and roughly around the same time that I did and experienced kind of the collapsing labor market and the series of, in my opinion, the extremely depressing failures of kind of leadership, both moral and material, from more powerful academics in a position to probably have provided leadership of a different kind than there has been. And, you know, like I'm just going to take the opportunity to comment that I always feel really skeptical when I hear people saying like, let's talk about how PhD programs could also prepare you for alternative careers. And by this, I mean the kind like a traditional conventional academic program could prepare you for alternative careers. There's nothing that my program could have done to have prepared me for the career that I have, the skills that I use for my current employment. I found those 100% on my own with zero support from anybody. And it's beyond me how the extremely kind of 20th century academics who trained me would have possessed anything worth transmitting for a genealogy other than kind of the continuation of their own. So if you ask me about my fellow travelers, I find myself criticizing kind of the assumption that genealogy is what we're actually here for.
Bill, you were looking like you were about to jump in, but
I'm sorry, Bill. I know that you represent something here. That's certain.
I know. No, I was going to jump in because I think that the point about how there's nothing that the 20th century scholars could have trained you that would have prepared you for what you're doing now speaks not just to a failure of how we've imagined like a graduate curriculum or what a PhD is for or whatever, but also a failure to try to create, to use what is available at the university to create some alternative platforms and spaces for other kinds of things to take place, right? And like
including organizing.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, we were talking to Hannah Appel last week or the week before about the Strike Debt Collective and other kind of debt resistance and refusal organizing that has a foot in various university spaces, but then also is very much elsewhere. But that depends on someone like Hannah being able to do that work and not having to worry that there's no way it's going to be recognized in her little review that she has to do every 2 years, right, for her real job. So, I mean, one of the things that Taylor and I have been wanting to explore in this series is really what are the possibilities of taking advantage of some of the relationships that have been created because of the decimation of the academic labor market, relationships with other kinds of institutions, with other kinds of entities, public and private, with other infrastructures, other supports that aren't meant for X, but which we can deploy for X.
Yeah, the relationships, but also the material resources, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested in being in a nonprofit that is small but still does have resources. How does one make use of those or redirect those in useful ways? And that's not a perfect solution by any means, but I do wonder about the maybe it's the optimist in me of the opportunities or possibilities there. So I guess, the question that I have about fellow travelers is there a way to imagine those kinds of networks? We don't have to talk specifics, but is there a way to imagine those kinds of networks or communities in a way that doesn't rely on the assumptions of genealogy, right? That I think that you're rightly pushing back on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good and important question what to do. This gets back to the fact that higher education is there and it is a big industry and it has tons of money compared to lots of other kinds of institutions. I think there's a lot of potential to do things with the resources that are there that are are more useful and less kind of implicitly cloistered. And, you know, I feel like in asking these kinds of questions, I imagine that I'm retracing a trajectory that has been retraced by many kinds of people who have been through higher education and thought about community engagement and thought about, you know, non-disciplinary forms of inquiry that might be relevant in the regions or communities where they find themselves, and different kinds of militant research and all of these kinds of things. So I think there are so many permutations of this that I don't even feel like I have a handle on all of them. And I feel like they've been out there for a long time, and in a way I'm coming at it from a very poor point of departure, because if you come from a research, like a kind of an elitist research environment, you're just bound to be less aware of those kinds of initiatives that have already been happening for some time, because there's a structure of occlusion that causes people in, I mean, I went to the University of Chicago. It's a place that has a toxic and racist relationship to its surroundings, and it's not a place where one would look comfortably for models of non-academic kind of world building. Anyway, so I feel like the question is urgent, and I almost feel poorly positioned to speak to it. I guess as a kind of as a non-academic, I mean, I think things that are useful in higher education is access to the books and electronic resources. And if I were in a position to very freely hand out kind of research affiliations to people without a lot of kind of overhead, and, you know, I think that obviously the institutional strictures on who has access are what they are, and one little corner of a university probably isn't going to change all of that in one stroke. But sometimes the kind of symbolic affiliation is quite easy to come by and can be useful for people. So I think of that. And I think that universities can be really good at publishing also. I mean, they're in some ways kind of calamitous and clumsy publishers, but it's very easy to do something in a university, like have a website and persuade the university that, like, for 10 years it should be there. And if you don't have access to electronic kind of like expertise and server infrastructure and things that are my work life, those are harder to come by. And so I think that there's a lot of resources in universities just for that too. So, because, you know, as we see with all the politics of who has access to social media and things like this, sometimes it's great, like really quite great, to be able to have like a digital existence that's funded by a nonprofit. And so I think that's also a thing that crosses my mind.
So, you know, I think one of the things that really strikes me in listening to you talk a little bit about the long histories of both, you know, important critiques and also some hand-wringing about the kind of future of the university, as well as the long histories of people thinking very creatively and very usefully about what alternatives might look like. You know, it strikes me that there's a limit maybe to conceptualization here, right? Or a limit to kind of theorization. And, you know, one of the things that we talked about in some of our previous communications is, you know, as one exits those academic spaces, where are the opportunities for, I think that, you know, you put it as kind of non-academic thought. And I think that that's a really useful phrasing. So I wonder if we might ask you to reflect a little bit on the politics of non-academic thought, and what are the opportunities for thinking outside of academic spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's useful for me just to retrace why, why I'm not that interested in identifying as an anthropologist, even though I put 15 years into identifying as an anthropologist. And that is like a kind of a bizarre amount of emotional labor to put into yourself, to kind of reiterate to yourself that there's a kind of a coherence, if you like, between the things that you're doing and the thing that may give you money to pay your rent, and like your identity, your being, if you like, your social being. And so one of the things that precarity does is to kind of tear apart these things, so that, like, you can't attach your dignity to the idea that you're doing academic work anymore, because the conditions are so, like, so tenuous and so emotionally unstable, and you're so invisible. And I mean, I just always think of what it's like to work in adjunct offices, because it's like something to work in adjunct offices, and to be in the population of people who work in adjunct offices. There's a certain kind of, you know, I think I had imagined from graduate school that, like, if you work in higher education, that people will kind of be interested in your existence as a human being, or perhaps like want to have lunch with you or something. And one of the things that I found out as a precarious worker is that nobody wants to have lunch with you or otherwise basically speak to you other than about some institutional things, or maybe to say hello to you in the hallway, which is not true for people who are senior and have seen thousands of precarious people already go through the hallway. Those kind of people will not say hi to you because they understand that you're about to vanish and they don't invest. And I know this is a generalization, but not being an academic at the moment, I feel comfortable in my generalization, my crass generalization. So I'm not that interested in identifying kind of with the discipline, because I found the discipline to be very, very mind bending, I guess, in terms of its capacity to encourage you to identify but refuse to nourish. And in as much as it is a thing, I found that it was a thing that was kind of painful. And I mean, at the same time, like publishing in scholarly journals is like a particular type of contortion. And after a while, one might want to do something else with one's thoughts, where there is less time spent like reading 5 books so that one can write a sentence, which just often feels like a really inefficient use of one's life. And so I guess the idea of non-academic thought is just kind of, what can one do given the fact that one exists as as somebody with training in social research and with a political conscience or whatever, with some amount of reflexivity and some access to different forms of inquiry. Like, what is one going to do with oneself? And the thing that has become most pertinent for me, which I hesitate to offer as a model to everybody because I got there in such a particular way, but I've become very interested in materialist feminist traditions, and I like them partly because they are not a discipline. I mean, I like them because they also make sense of my life in a way that kind of my conventional disciplinary training has ceased to help me make sense of my life, because it helps me to think much more about kind of domestic labor and kind of emotional and mental labor and things that are pertinent to my somewhat cramped existence as a parent with 2 little children in COVID times. And thinking about gender and having kind of a gender transition into being more publicly non-binary. I mean, I was a genderqueer person from the minute that I started graduate school, but I didn't talk about that to people. So that has changed. The culture has changed too. So there's a reason for being more open about it. So I have become interested in materialist feminism because it provides. I mean, I hesitate to kind of claim it as my identity because there's so much structure around who's licensed to kind of affiliate with feminism as an identity, and so much tension around kind of the politics of trans and non-binary people affiliating themselves with feminism in that way. So I hesitate to make it into a kind of a core identity being category. But at the same time, I ask myself, like, am I sure that I need another replacement identity being category in the way that kind of being an academic used to be one that kind of brings together all these different parts of one's habitus and practices and work life? Like, maybe that kind of coherence is one that has costs that are significant if you're not in an institution that facilitates them. And I don't think, I think that people are always thinking. So the question of non-academic thought in some ways is a very difficult question, because it just seems to everybody's thinking, and it's only in academia, right? Can one imagine that outside of academia people are thinking less or in some more vernacular way or something like that? So I would absolutely hesitate to kind of draw too stark a distinction that way. But I think that the question is, like, one has some training and one has some capacity for inquiry, and how is one going to organize that in such a way as to be meaningful and to reach people? It's really not an answer, because I don't really have an answer to this. I just know that, the question of like having an intellectual life is important, and it's important to me, at least. I don't really want to universalize that point. And how to have an intellectual life in a way that doesn't involve kind of as much academic infrastructure is tough. And I think there are these other kinds of spaces and models, and I'm trying to find them. Well, in a lot of ways they're out there, and it's just a question of how does one come across them.
I think, Eli, you're underscoring this sort of implicit demand that goes along with the institutionalization of knowledge and field formation and all of that. And that's the demand of identification, right?
Yeah,
if you're gonna do this thing, you must have that identity. You must have had that calling, right? And so, in some sense, if the institution isn't what we thought it was or is being dismantled, how can we even think about the notion of that kind of calling and that kind of fit between the identity and the institution anymore, right? So it's sort of not a refusal of identity as such, but of that demand for identification.
Sure. Yeah.
And then that leaves us asking then, what are the other sorts of spaces and institutions or communities or forms of organization that can operate absent that notion of identification or calling.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just going to kind of throw out a theory here, which I think has to do with why people go into academia anyway in the first place when especially I'm thinking of people who, like me, try to go into academia in their like early 20s. So it's before having had like decades of other kinds of working lives or something like this. And I think that without necessarily using the word calling, there's a kind of legibility to the conventional academic career that you just don't find in like a lot of other parts of the kind of the economy in the global north. There's kind of an idea that you can get a training and it will make you into like a legible and respectable type of person, and you will find fulfillment in your work and you'll be able to kind of practice your thing until retirement or something like that. This just is like a kind of linearity to life, a kind of imagined, kind of clarity to one's existence that even if one doesn't really grasp the material details can kind of give some optimism to the idea of going to graduate school. And one which I think involves all of these ideas about identifying with probably people who are once teachers and with kind of a cultural image about what being a professor might be and a scholar and these kinds of things. And I feel like this kind of fantasy is the thing that brings people into the academy as doctoral students, or I think one should really call them kind of entry-level research workers. But and I think that it's just very difficult to understand that actually there's like a lot about this fantasy is not going to obtain. And this is a structural fact, whatever might be the outcome in particular cases.
Yeah, and I think it's a fantasy that brings people in and then obviously, produces a kind of stickiness, right? That makes it hard to leave or hard to separate. Right? So I wonder, before we bring in Nina, and Kim, I wonder if I might ask you, Eli, to reflect a little bit on the leaving, if you feel up to it, to think about, what is involved in that process.
Yeah, I asked on Twitter, this is like, we'll make this very very modern, right? I asked on Twitter what people's rituals for leaving academia were. And a few of their answers, let me see if I can find this.
I love this, by the way. This is the most recursive Zoom webinar. This is great.
One person says, I've just wanted to relax and avoided the plague. Not sure if that's a forever thing, just trying to see what I might be like without it, what I might be like without it. So an issue of books. One person says, it was a long time ago, but I had to learn that I didn't have failed at graduate school written on my forehead. For me, that meant hanging out with visual artists and talking about their work, not mine, which I find actually really kind of an intriguing image of self-backgrounding. A couple of people talked about kind of just like the economic transition to having the economic ability to like purchase things. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. Selfishly enjoying the ability to support a family and being able to make selfish purchases. Another person says retail therapy really worked for me in a sense. And in a way these sound, I really actually really like these, and I like the idea as kind of, as, I'm not sure what the word is that I'm looking for. This is like not kind of Greek tragedy type of ritual, right? This is like a much more kind of down to earth type of leaving response. I think that none of these would be my response, but I guess I think, I think leaving is a practice that one can develop. And one of the things that in a weird way one gets better at by being a precarious academic for multiple years is leaving, and kind of just the weight of having to carry around one's life to wherever is the next gig, which is absolutely economically unsustainable and unjust, I might add. And so I think that there's kind of I think there are different arts and practices that one can use. I'm kind of in favor of the walk home, just to kind of look at what the environment is like. Actually, I'll tell you a little story. I don't know if this is my whole answer to this question, because that would be like a multi-year answer. But at the end of my postdoc, which I was leaving for my South African job afterwards, and about to separate from my family, and kind of just generally like in a really dire state of mind, I was like really unhappy to find out that the last requirement of people whose contracts were ending was to show up at graduation in their like fancy gowns, and be like the face of the institution, like right next to the kind of permanent people who would never give you the time of day. And so I remember having like the worst mood, and I'm not trying to, like, I'm not always like a person in a really bad mood, like I think, but this was a moment that was like I was really in a bad mood, because I had to like acquire like this fancy gown, which I had never wanted to really have. I think they lent it to me actually, and show up and be like this ritual figure, and like listen to bombastic speeches, and kind of sit on a little platform. It was a small college, so it's not a place with like I guess they needed the precarious people to make the ceremony look good, because the reason why there were so many precarious people is that they were in bad shape and couldn't afford to hire enough permanent people to replace the permanent people who had been leaving. So it's a small college that depended on precarious labor to survive, even though it threw them out at the end of their contracts. And I just remember like sitting on this platform and thinking like, well, I guess now I know what it's like to go to college graduation from the perspective of faculty. And it's funny, and full of all the flags. It was like in a football stadium, I think, and full of kind of signs of ritualization. And afterwards, everyone was going off to have a reception or something. And I remember just finding this path that was like literally out into the woods, because it was at the end of campus, and there was just like literally brush and like a wooded trail, and everyone else is going this way, like in a crowd, and I'm going this way, like literally into like a dirt path. And after probably about 500 feet, like the noise had died down, and all you could see was kind of the plants and a bit of bird life. And it's like both very lonely and kind of beautiful. Anyway, I don't recommend this to anybody as a ritual of leaving, but for me, it kind of marked a certain ending. Yeah.
I think it's, one of the things that this makes me think about is the possibility and maybe the need to, if indeed part of the goal is to remake the academic institution to allow for alternatives in identities as well as, true kind of labor prospects, then part of the remaking has to involve then making people, giving people practice in leaving in a way that is also, does not exploit it and, undermine their personal and material security.
Yeah, it would be nice if leaving could be kind of like a less traumatic prospect, but the problem is that it's so tied up with like the ability to literally pay one's rent the next month that it's not very easy to imagine a version of leaving that doesn't activate every type of economic insecurity, not to mention other kinds of insecurity as well. Let's have the Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll turn it over to Nina, Nima, and Kim.
Yeah, thank you so much for really pushing some of how we frame questions of precarity and of leaving. And I know you've written about it elsewhere, building on one of the questions from Peter in the chat. You've certainly written extensively about how precarity gets invoked by relatively secure academics to problematize the condition of those in less secure positions without necessarily building that kind of lateral solidarity. And from Peter, what's your perspective on the politicization of relatively secure tech workers? For instance, Alphabet, like, are there similar dynamics that you see between the relatively secure and precarious labor forces? And are some of these identities and/or politics spilling over from academia or growing out of similar structural conditions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's hard for me to answer because I'm not like a scholar of tech labor. I think the first thing I would say about tech labor is that even though the kind of large corporations like Alphabet or Google are the most visible and the most in the news, the tech workforce is extremely differentiated in its organizational terms. You know, there are tech workers in higher education. They're very invisibilized. I can tell you that it's a different version of being an invisible person on campus is to be the campus IT worker, because that's what I did when I was finishing graduate school. It's also quite illuminating in a sad way to see how academics treat tech workers in their workplace and what they assume about them as people. But anyway, so I think I would say that I think that it depends so much what type of organization you look at in terms of kind of the employment conditions and the kind of access to some kind of political consciousness or organizing. It's I guess I think the main thing the first coherent thing I have to say about this is that there's something interesting about how, like graduate labor organizations are very visible in big research universities. The places where they manage to get in the news are like they're the graduate student union at NYU, or they're the graduate student union in University of California, maybe, or Michigan, or University of Chicago, where I was involved in it. And similarly, the union efforts at a place like Google are very in the news. And it's actually hard, if what one reads is kind of the media, to know what labor conditions are like in places that are too small or too peripheral to attract any kind of attention. So I feel like I don't really know how to give a structural answer to that, because I feel like I haven't even seen really the kind of research or data that I would feel like I wanted to have to look into that. Now I sound like an academic though, right? Like very, very cautious in the face of ignorance.
I think what's really interesting about this question, and then we can move on, but it is the question is about the possibility for not just a structural position, but maybe a kind of structure of feeling or that demand for identification in a different way to form the basis for organization, right? Across very different kinds of sectors, or even up and down, as you were pointing out, different positions within the same
absolutely
sector. So.
Yeah, I guess I would just say on that note that part of what seems to be at stake in the tech union types of things is this discovery that we're actually workers. We're workers like other workers. We're workers whose relationship to the structures of power in our side of employment is often not advantageous. And we're workers who have potentially, and I don't want to make too much of this because the salaries in a place like Google, I think, are quite astronomical. I mean, if you're the software developer, at least. But I think there's kind of a discovery that, having been told that, you are a desirable kind of actor of your own career, kind of in the neoliberal sense of being like a strategic actor with human capital and things, and everyone is like potentially an entrepreneur, right? Like you're supposed to have kind of a entrepreneurial relationship to your career. And so to discover after that actually you were labor can be something that sparks politicization in an interesting way, I think. So I'll say that much, but I think I'll refrain from saying more than that.
Thank you, Eli. I'm actually going to take this opportunity to voice a question that you had brought up in our earlier conversation. So I think I'm going to actually, I'm kind of reverting to that question also because it spoke to me in thinking about the distance that being in the academia for first gen folks implies. And so this question really spoke to me, and I'm going to read it out as you had articulated it. So what does it mean to mourn dead academic careers and identities, etc.? And what does this do to our friends, relationships, networks, which were often premised on the assumption of a sort of a common academic way of being. Thank you.
Yeah. What do you think? Am I allowed to ask that?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just, I think like for me, I didn't have much of a plan in terms of like, okay, this is going to lead to something. It was like more like, okay, getting this degree as a part of something. And it was also the most secure, employment I had ever. So I think like, and since I haven't finished it yet, I hadn't even thought about that question, but when you articulated it, it kind of really resonated to me in terms of like the distances that keep along and kind of like, you kind of have to track and also contend with as you go along. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it goes back to the question about ritual, I guess, and things and how one departs from things. And there's no answer besides the one that one kind of figures out by living it, unfortunately. And I mean, I think a point of comparison that I find kind of interesting is, it's interesting if you look at retired academics of the 20th century type, because they also leave in a certain way. They're old and they often retire. I mean, there's a tradition of never retiring in some places, but a lot of them do retire and they kind of fade. That's my experience of having met a number of academics like that. Like they might continue doing some things and some research related things or a bit of teaching or something, but they often kind of dwindle. And I've been interested in like the kind of their ritual for leaving, which is to get rid of their often gargantuan book collections and to depart the office because finally someone told them that they weren't allowed to just keep having the office, even though they didn't use it that much or whatever was the rule about that. So I think that one can even find among kind of the people who had a long academic career, kind of this other kinds of departure, which I assume, and I think that this has been a bit true for me too, you kind of find out who your friends are in a way. Like you find out who actually was interested in you for reasons other than kind of the instrumental game of like, I need to have a network of people in my field and I need to send things to people just because kind of that's the thing that in some weird way you're taught is like the way that you keep your identity out there. And all of these kinds of, as anthropologists, unfortunately, are well positioned to talk about that thing where you kind of circulate your goods and then your reputation grows and yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to rehearse that, but you find out that when you're not doing that kind of circulation, that some people are still there and you might be still interested in what they are also thinking about or in them as kind of as friends of some kind. And I think that, I was afraid, and in this sense, I will be less melodramatic. And in general, I think that resisting melodrama is good when it's appropriate. Sometimes it's reactionary to resist drama. It's reactionary to resist the drama of people who have been excluded from an institution. So I think that I don't want to resist that kind of drama. But a particular drama that I think that I had in leaving the academy was, like maybe nobody will respect me anymore in a way that I had become accustomed in this very precarious way that you get from your things, from feeling kind of respected or seen or held. And that's not entirely true, actually. It turns out that a lot of that can stick around even if you're doing something else. And that's been a happy discovery, actually. That sometimes the relationships do continue. But I mean, the relationships with people who I was in touch with purely because like we had published things in the same general region of the world, et cetera, like that has dwindled. And I think none of us will shed tears for it because it's instrumental.
I guguess I'll go next. Sorry, I was just distracted by my roommates walking back and forth. But I think I just kind of picking up on this question a little bit. I want to take you, well, not really to task, but just kind of like a pushback against this idea of materialist feminists not being a discipline. As someone who comes from a gender, women, and sexuality studies department, and as someone who is within the interdisciplines of like critical ethnic studies and that whole field of things. But one of the things that I was thinking about is Jigna Desai and Kevin Murphy have this article that came out in the Journal of Critical Ethnic Studies called Subjectively Inhabiting the University. And there's this quote that I wanted to read out, which is kind of their invitation to subjectively inhabit the university, which is our mood for ethnic and GWSFQ, the like fancy genderqueer or gender woman sexuality studies area. Our mood for these studies is not indicative certainty nor imperative command, but one of the subjunctive hope and doubt. And I was just like, it really resonated to me about when we were having this whole conversation about how the subjunctive was kind of there in a way, but I think like there's a shadow of doubt that comes with like more than the hope comes through. And I kind of like am thinking through this thing where like I wonder, like we've talked so much about leaving, but I wonder about entering in a lot of ways. Because when I went into grad school, I was actually like shocked that I even made it into a master's program. I'm shocked I'm on this webinar, frankly. I got desk rejected by a bunch of philosophy programs and sociology programs back when I was an undergrad. And then I went to a master's while working full time and did that over the course of 3 years, just so I could make my way into a PhD program eventually, which felt like a scam, but it worked out. Nothing but love to University of Maryland, they're great. So I guess just kind of like, as we're kind of like, I know we're talking about like sort of the afterlife of the academy, but I wonder if you had any visions for how we can reimagine even like the entrance into the academy and how people as graduate students can re-envision their relationship to this institution to be one that's more subjective and what that might mean.
Yeah. Comment that materialist feminism is a discipline if you practice it as a discipline. I think the way that I put it was a little bit too egocentric. Actually, I have experienced it as a non-disciplined and in some cases non-academic kind of field of reading, like around things like Viewpoint magazine, for example, which doesn't feel to me like academic and kind of in the way that I was taught academia is supposed to work, for example. But I'm sorry for kind of stating that in a too generalized way. As far as kind of how to inhabit the university, I mean, there's part of me that thinks, it's great to have some distance from some of the constraints of other kinds of labor discipline and relations for the amount of time that one is in graduate school. One can think of it as a job. I think that for me was an important thought, and in the face of more conventional, I'm going to keep calling them 20th century academics because it seems like such an exact way of naming the generational disparity at stake here. I think that thinking of it as labor continues to be an important break with some of those kinds of assumptions, the calling assumptions, and those kinds of the reproductive assumptions. I mean, I think if one thinks of it as precarious from the get-go, then one is probably potentially not going to have to kind of reckon with the same sorts of loss at the non-obtaining of the stability promises that are often out there. So in as much as that's possible, it sounds like a path towards a bit of mental tranquility or something. And I think, I don't know. I mean, I think that there are, I don't know what other people's experiences in academia, in graduate school. I mean, my experience in graduate school is that some graduate students like really are very polished from early on and inhabit a relationship to the career that seems likely to be effective. I mean, it's not guaranteed to be effective anymore, even if it was 10 years ago. But and some people don't inhabit as polished a relationship to the career, and you can often sense that probably will cost them. And I think that, I mean, I don't want to be a positivist about this, but I can certainly think of many cases from my own experience where the people who were the least successful at kind of inhabiting a certain kind of career norm and style of self-presentation and work ethic and things like this did suffer in their careers and were more precarious. I think that's a pattern that I saw. I'm not going to make claims about kind of big empirical claims about it. So I think there are existential questions if one is in graduate school about what kinds of things one hopes to get out of it and what things in one's way of being in the world one is ready to do to get those things. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but one can choose to kind of be more conventionally legible in terms of the more academic side of a discipline or not. And there's a cost to all kinds of stance taking and also possible advantages and potential for friendships and comrades and things. So I guess to me, I don't know if I think of graduate school as I mean, my experience is that graduate school is too subjunctive. So I don't really, but I've been out of it for 6 years. So maybe what I remember is the subjunctive part of it better. And memory is very tricky. I guess this is the most sensible thing I have to say about this. I think, and this is why precarity is so hard to talk about. There's so much at stake in appearing to be successful. There's so much at stake in appearing to be legible. There's so much at stake in kind of how one presents oneself to other people in academia that every time one does a biography, there's a potential for some strategic choice and the potential for misrecognition, strategic or inadvertent, I guess. And so I think one has to, in some ways, kind of, I mean, to me, if I were doing graduate school again, I would de-dramatize. I would enjoy the moments where I was at some distance from certain kinds of labor discipline. I would have done the inquiry that I wanted to do, maybe even more than I did. Although I was always a very bad student. I always pity everyone who was my teacher because I was very, very, like, I'm doing it my way, you know, and which caused some issues sometimes. And arguably very gendered too, I don't know. That would have been my strategy, but it's not everybody's strategy, and I respect the strategic choices in graduate school. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. They're all really good questions. Thank you, everybody.
So as we approach kind of the end of our hour together, I wish we had more time. You know, I wanted to maybe circle back for one final question on something that you mentioned earlier, Eli, you know, which is to ask a little bit about your experience with the Anthropology Collective, this kind of year-long experiment to build something. And so, you know, maybe building a little bit on Nina's question building on Nina's question, you know, what do you think are there lessons learned or you know, maybe not, but wonder if you could share with us a little bit about your experience and some of the lessons that you might identify in building some kind of institution or organization. And I don't exactly know how to identify it because, you know, I think that a lot of the debates involved were debates about how to self-identify organizationally, but I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on that experience as a way to think about what might be possible for us in terms of building alternatives of one variety or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so really briefly for people who didn't encounter this project, it's a project that began on Twitter and attracted probably like a couple of hundred people who are interested in the idea of having an alternative, mostly online anthropology collective or association of a kind that was not going to be tied to the existing kinds of scholarly societies, but that might take up some of their functions. And I guess what I would say about this was the project needs doing. Someone could still do it. The infrastructure is still there from this one, although I don't know whether anyone would ever want the specific infrastructure of this project. I would say mainly what I learned was that I was not a good enough organizer to actually make it happen. And I think that there was part of that had to do with the fact that, like, I believed in a type of activism where you're like 10 people sitting in a room and figuring out all your differences. That just doesn't work when there are dozens of people chatting with each other in an online chat. Like, people just leave when they can't get heard in a way that, like, people don't leave people leave, of course, when they're like sitting in small group affinity activist settings out of the same kinds of frustrations, I think, or underlying political differences. But people leave much faster when it's just like, well, nobody paid attention to me and I didn't it's not going the way I want, and it's also aggravating and a lot of work. So I think that the form of, if I were doing it again, I think the way to do this is to have a group of like literally 6 or 10 people who are going to be the leadership. I'm not in favor of leadership in principle, but in practice it seems to be essential. And so I think that was kind of the single bad choice that, from a structural perspective, made it really hard to get that project to kind of keep going. And I think the thing is, it wanted to be all kinds of things to all kinds of, and I think that if you're going to start a new thing, it's probably better to do one thing really well than to allow people to have fantasies that you can be, you know, kind of a really politically radical organization on one hand, and also provide infrastructure for people looking for kind of more pragmatic things to affiliate with and provide publishing, which was a big desire, an online conference and these kinds of things. So there's just a lot of genuine difference of desire, and a better solution to the diversity of desire was something we didn't find. But I think the desire for that project to exist is absolutely still out there. I don't think it's gone anywhere at all. And so I hope that someone will do a better job of it than we did.
I think that that's a lovely place to end with, you know, maybe a semi-failed experiment that yet lives on, with the invitation to pick it back up. Eli, thank you so much for joining us. This has been, this hour has absolutely flown by, and it's been a really, really educational one and hopeful one, actually, for me, despite the, you know, the sort of occupation of spaces of doubt and mourning, maybe. So, you know, I do really appreciate you taking the time with us.
Thanks everybody. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks Eli. Thanks Nina, and Kim. And also thank you to Lori Yeager-Stavropoulos, who's been captioning this, as well as Jenny Fan and Andy Hill, who have been in the background making sure that we have a safe and sane webinar. Thanks to all who came today. This has been recorded and will be posted on the Social Sciences and White Men website in due course. And our next conversation is, I think, Taylor, February 5th?
Correct, February 5th.
I don't have it in front of me.
February 5th, and we'll be meeting with Alberto Corcin Jimenez with the Spanish National Research Council to talk about kind of public, open, libre commons, thinking about cultures of liberation and the liberation of culture in anthropology. So that will be very fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.